In this episode, we discuss illiberalism, which, you look at in opposition to the idea of liberalism that forms the philosophical basis for the American system and the American Constitution. And some recent articles that suggest that homegrown illiberalism actually is something that has always been here and always been sitting there in opposition to liberalism that we know, and not just some periodic diversion that pops up from time to time in American culture. And later on, we'll take a brief look at recent studies on fluoride consumption, particularly in tap water, and the protests in New Caledonia. Hello, welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and riding shotgun with me is a man who, unlike some podcasters, always keeps it 100 when he's doing his podcast thing. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, you ready to show the people how these other podcasters are not like us?
Yeah, man. Do I keep it 100 while I'm sleeping?
Hey, man, that's for you to say, man. I can't speak on that.
I don't think so, but I'll just check it.
There we go.
So,
all right. Well, now before we get started, if you enjoy the show, I ask that you hit subscribe and like the show on YouTube or your podcast app. Doing so really helps the show out. Now we're recording on May 21st, 2024. And Tunde, I want to just first kind of lay out illiberalism and, what we mean when we're saying that. And then I want to kick it to you for just your thoughts on, just how prevalent this ideology is or may be in America. So according to Cambridge Dictionary, illiberalism is about limiting freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of behavior. So it's about either an ideology that's about trying to limit people in that way, or a kind of mental framework where you are trying to impose limits on people's ability to express themselves or to do certain things and so forth. And that's, again, in contrast to liberalism, which is about liberty and, about freedom and so forth. So, but freedom that's applied to everyone in a society. Illiberalism might be trying to restrict that stuff to only one segment or section in society. So, Tunde, what do you make of the idea that American history, that over the course of American history, illiberalism is not some marginal part of the nation's political identity, but rather has been a central feature that has stood in opposition to liberalism in many respects?
It's a very interesting observation and concept, and I think.
Yeah, and by the way, just real quick, we'll have some in the show notes. We'll have some recent articles that have discussed this, and then discussing just kind of taking a really deep dive into this. That some of the stuff we used as source here. Sorry.
And no, so it's I just think it's one of those things that to hear it said like that doesn't feel good, because we have been taught as Americans to believe in things like liberty and the pursuit of happiness and our freedoms, and that we are, the shining city on the hill. So, to think of an America with a past that, was illiberal in that sense is not something we're really taught. And I think, it's important to, let's say, for the audience here, to really make a distinction between the terms, liberal and illiberal in the sense of what we're discussing. Because I think, as I was even preparing for today's discussion, I'm indoctrinated with the modern American political culture where the word liberal was always a pejorative during most of my life. I was born in the late 70s. So the liberals were the people that my parents and grandparents used to talk about were the hippies, in the 60s and smoking grass at Woodstock. And so this idea of liberalism is something that I had to learn actually over, just as an adult, which is really the idea of liberal ideals are a founding part of the American system and our documents. The founding fathers really had a liberal view of America. And I think even to hear myself say that right now, in the backdrop of our modern political and cultural discourse, it doesn't sound like it jives. And I think that's kind of the interesting part of me to having this conversation with you today, is really unpacking what does it mean, the idea of liberalism versus illiberalism. So, yeah, I think that I've been indoctrinated with American history to not believe that we've had a majority of the history being illiberal, in different pockets of our culture and our society. So we'll
Yeah,
have
I
an
mean,
interesting discussion.
well, no, I mean, and the you mentioned, like the making the word out liberal to be a pejorative, and how that is something, a recent phenomenon over the last 40 years or so. When prior to that, Americans of all political parties or whatever would consider would recognize and understand themselves to be part of a liberal democracy. Whereas now, if you say that to some people, a lot of people, they probably wouldn't recognize. Oh, yeah, this whole system is set up a foundation of liberal ideas. And that to me is telling. But actually, to me, this idea isn't that like it didn't strike me as particularly odd or something that came out of nowhere. I mean, I when I read American history, and the stuff that is taught, there's illiberalism all throughout it. Like when I look at the ideals of the founding documents, whether it be the Declaration of Independence, the things that are espoused, or even the Constitution and so forth. The First Amendment is an exercise in liberalism. And, but it's all throughout the documents. What I see is that stuff was really aspirational. I don't know that the country's ever lived up to its liberal ideals. The point was to put that stuff down on paper and then try to work towards it, which I'd say over the long arc of history, the United States has worked towards its liberal ideals and gotten closer and closer to them over the backlash and reactionary like behaviors and mentalities that have popped up as it's gone on that journey. So it seems more like this was an aspirational thing that the founding fathers set up. Like, hey, we want to try to create a liberal democracy, understanding that by saying only white male landowners could vote at the time, or that people of the Negro race were only counted as 3/5 of a person from a representation standpoint, was not, they weren't living up to it. They knew they weren't living up to it. But then if you track it throughout, like I even the more recent history, I learned about, when I'm a kid, I learned about the civil rights movement. Well, what were the civil rights movement trying to overcome? Well, they're trying to overcome Jim Crow, the Jim Crow system. And they're subjected to lynchings and all that stuff is illiberal. Jim Crow, lynchings are like it's. So again, to me, like it depends on what you want to focus on in terms of, the when you look back at American history, it's like, oh, well, roses and everything like that. Or it's like, well, no, hold on. This has been a struggle for the whole time. And like I said, what it means is that the target was set initially, but we're not sitting at that. We're not sitting at the finish line. We weren't born into that. Neither were the people who were before us. And so we're just continuing for people who believe in the ideals espoused in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and all that. We are trying to work towards that. And then there has been, and there will be resistance to that from homegrown illiberal forces.
Yeah. And I think, because it's interesting, part of this is like the human stuff that we know that there's
it's all the human stuff. Illiberalism is an exception to humans, or excuse me, let me restate that. It's all the exception. Most societies throughout history have been illiberal. Liberalism is the exception. They're trying to say, okay, all of the stuff that's really hard for us to do, humans, from a human nature standpoint, let's try to do that stuff and create a more just society, a more fair society. Let's see if we can pull it off. So it's an exception, 100%. It was set up.
Well, I think, and it's fascinating if you think about, what was it 8,500 years ago was Hammurabi's Code, which is kind of considered the first, at least, found and known documents of hierarchies in the society. And the United States experiment is roughly, and the United States is roughly 250 years old, and it's the longest liberal experiment in human history. So. You're right. That's my point of just making that historic time contrast is that, this is a short-lived experiment. And it has, like you said, continued to evolve. And I think that's what I'm saying is that this tension, because in America, the illiberal forces have played out historically. And like you're saying, the fault lines have been fault lines of race, patriarchy with the feminist movement and women's suffrage. In our lifetime, maybe it was the LGBT, crowd that really began to get its own freedom and justices starting in the late 70s into the 80s.
If you go back further, it's the Protestants, were, like very, very much saying, hey, it's Protestant. It's how we do it. Catholics, y'all can get out of here too, type of thing. But go ahead.
No, and that's a great point that the country was founded in a sense of people looking to break away from the illiberal monarchies and the Catholic Church's dominance in Europe. And that's the amazing tension in the United States and our history, which is the country is founded by people who wanted to get away from someone else with their foot on their back and on their neck and kind of getting King George off their back, getting the Catholic Church off their back, all these other cultural things that were going on at the time. During that time, they also oppressed other people. And, whether Native Americans, African slaves, the whole thing, right?
And like that's the human element you speak of.
That's the human element. And that's what I'm saying. And within those, after even like the Civil War and all that, you make a good point. There was the ostracism of Catholics. And then in the early 20th century, it was the Eastern Europeans, the Italians, the Russians, the Greeks. They were considered on the same part of the caste system as blacks back then. And so it's interesting that illiberalism does require an us versus them mentality and a certain level of playing on people's fear. And I think for you and I personally, and people our age and younger, this last, decade or so is the first time we've seen this play out in the open in American politics and culture, where in most of our lifetime, it was an energy that was kind of put to the side in a sense, or at least there was a lid kept on it. And I think, to your point, that's why to guys like me and you, this is a little bit like, whoa, what's going on? But I think when you look at the history of the 250 plus years and even back to the colonies, this is not abnormal at all.
Well, one thing I'll say, but I do want to keep us moving in the conversation, but you say, the country was founded by people, that were like escaping, the systems in Europe where they may have been subject to oppression or illiberal forces where they were the target. I would reframe that a little bit. It was settled by those types of people, but it was founded. I mean, this is interesting about the United States. It was founded by intellectuals, and they putting together all this, again, this high-minded stuff like, hey, maybe we can do something that's never been done before. And we can create this society that is governed by rule of law. Everybody is subject to the same laws, whether you're in government or whether, everybody likes you or whether everybody hates you. You all got to be subjected to the same law. And, things like that and voting and, like a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, like all that kind of stuff. This is intellectuals coming up with this stuff, and again, it wasn't a guarantee that we'd be able to pull it off. And so but that doesn't mean that all the people immediately were just like, yeah, let's do it. We're all in for this. The people are still human beings. And so you have to aspire to these liberal ideals in order to try to live that stuff. The easy thing to do is when someone's different to try to ostracize them or minimize them and be tribal. Like that's the kind of, and I say easy in the sense that that's our natural inclination as human beings. It always takes more effort to go beyond, but that was the system that was set up by the founding fathers of the United States. So there's a level of, and we'll get into this later, but a level of patriotism that is required to take a second and try to allow the illiberal kind of impulse that may be in all human beings to try to settle that and then say, okay, well, what are my principles though? What are what are the things that I hold dear about what I believe about my country and so forth? And so, that's just not an exercise for everyone. Or that everyone's going to be able to do. Like, so the idea that it seems to me that when people see the illiberalism play out in ways that they expect, they don't see it. Like people would, if you go to the 1950s and you start talking about, oh, this is a very illiberal country because of Jim Crow, people would look at you like you were crazy. Like, oh, but that's just the way it is, so to speak. But when we see it play out in January 6th, and people are like, oh, we're going to by force rush the government and prevent them from operating because we don't like the way it's going to go. People say, and they're like, oh my God, that's how could that happen here? And it's like, well, but that's kind of the same, that's the same kind of ideology at play there where you're going to by force make something happen that is against kind of, the idea of liberty and freedom and so forth and voting and all that kind of stuff. And so I think our expectations in terms of what in society play a role to whether we even see the illiberalism that may be around us at a given point. And so I do want to ask you that specifically, though, and I kind of got to it a little bit, but I have some more on it. But just why do you think so many Americans tend to like believe or at least express when, like, I guess the January 6th was the most recent example we can look at where people are like, that's just not America. This whole rushing, the Capitol and, like saying that, the voting, we're not going to follow the voting and whatever. Like, that's just not America, or making up that it's not, that, or just saying that it's not, the voting's not legit without being able to prove it, which I could call that making that up. But nonetheless, like kind of, that looking at that, so many people express so much surprise, like, oh, well, how this just isn't America. How could that be? Why do you think that is?
Because we don't teach ourselves our own history. That's why. And you know what? It's interesting. And even just preparing for today, I used to think that the lost cause and these other types of, really myths in American culture and our society in general, the idea of heritage, not hate, for people that fly the Confederate flag, when we know if you just read the writings of the founders of the Confederacy, they exactly
were about hate.
Us all that it was all about hate.
Yeah.
And it was all about keeping people in slavery and all the stuff that for whatever reason Americans just don't want to talk about. So I think, and what I was going to say is the lost cause, I used to think just affected people who wanted to believe in the Confederacy not being what it was. But what I realized just as I was thinking about that question is, no, it's actually the lost cause was successful in indoctrinating all Americans, both people who support the Confederacy and people who didn't. Because by the time you and I are born, maybe not 100 years before when there was still a living memory of the Civil War, but by the time you and I are born, everybody believed that the nation had never had certain behaviors, right? Or at least, you and I grew up in the living memory of certain things that did happen, the 1960s and prior. But, I think people just want to believe and have a certain romanticized view of our history. And I don't think that's abnormal. I think every society is prone to that. But I do think that, because you say something profound that I don't think is really mentioned and also boasted about with pride, is that this country was founded by intellectuals. That's a very unique position to be in, because most nations are founded through war, and then the warlords and the strongest people end up winning.
Just took power.
That's why it's interesting the way you're saying, because number one, the reason I bring it up is because what they saw was the effects of tribalism in Europe, which we've discussed at various different points in our show's history, and what we just discussed earlier about the religious tribalism, the cultural tribalism, so on and so forth.
Partisanship, which can be a form of tribalism as well.
And then you have a country made up of all these Europeans that need to figure out how we're going to, their descendants that are here on the American side, and trying to figure out how are we all going to coexist. So you're right. It took an intellectual way of developing a system that forced debate. So number one was the getting back to the specifics of the liberal and the liberalism of the system. Number one, just the setup of separation of powers, so that you try and avoid a dictatorial or monarchical style of rule, where the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative branch share co-equal power in running the nation. And then the second thing I would say is, during that time, and this is a very interesting conversation where it's going, because as you're talking, it makes me think about the idea of conservatism. And the original conservatives, like John Locke and a lot of the intellectual conservatives of the Enlightenment into the American Revolution, the reason of conservative thought was to try and keep at bay the tribalism and the people that just wanted to rule and have people rule them with passions only. And it's kind of no coincidence to me that during this time, books like The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, which is an intellectual way to look at trade and capital, right? And people like John Hamilton trying to figure out from an intellectual way how we're going to set up this economy. Because it really is liberal government with the ability to express ideas through intellectual thought also bode well with open economies. And I think that, the United States benefited from kind of this melding of both at the time. And, it's
going back to
interesting that all was on the backdrop of still illiberal practices within the country.
Well, they operated at the same time. Like going back just to the idea of like why Americans always express surprise. Like I said before, some of it's the kind of expectations. When whatever is going on at the moment, it seems like people associate that with their country and associate that with what's quote unquote normal. And so it's only can be revealed as illiberal when it's something that's different. But building on that, I think you raised a good point when you first started with that, which is the idea of not knowing the history. And not knowing the history ends up resulting in, like, for example, January 6th is actually a mild example of kind of an illiberal approach to trying to take power in government. There have been others in American. I mean, the Civil War, obviously, where the certain states didn't like the way the election turned out, and so they said, "Hey, we're out. We're seceding. We're declaring war on you guys. Or we're going to fight you guys over this." And so that's that. January 6th is not as bad as that. Clearly, the Wilmington Massacre, 1898. January 6th isn't as bad as that. Like they actually did kill the people who had been elected, or killed enough of them that the other people that were elected were like, all right, I'm out, and took over the government in the city of Wilmington, North Carolina. And so that was much more extreme. So if you look at it from that standpoint, if you aren't aware, if you don't look at the Civil War as that, if you look at this over states' rights and not like, hey, we didn't want Lincoln to be elected, so we're out. And so to speak, even though, we were a part of it before that. Or if you don't know about Wilmington, and again, that was much more obscure in terms of a historical aspect. Or if you just don't connect it to the idea of when Black people would try to vote, after the 13th Amendment was passed, and 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote. After all that was passed, if Black people were trying to try to vote, they were hung, in certain parts of the country, or, like, if you don't, connect all those things from a historical standpoint, then if you see people talking about, like, hey, let's just take power, or let's just have one party rule for forever, type of thing, then that stuff is like, man, what happened to liberalism? What happened to, that's a very illiberal approach. Where did that come from? And it's like, well, to me, if you look at the history, you can see it constantly there. And we've talked about this in other shows. And I think this is really where you go with that, is that what this reveals, like having this kind of in your mind, rose-colored glass, oh, well, everybody here is on this same idea of liberty for all. You aren't prepared for the fact that there's an ongoing fight and there's no finish line. There's always going to be forces trying to move to move us to a system of a more hierarchical system that it has more illiberal principles, not liberty, not liberty for all, but liberty for some, and others have to live under a hierarchy. And so being aware of the constant tug of war that's going on can help you better prepare for that and understand. When you see it, you can recognize it and say, oh, okay, that's these forces working at bay, trying to move the country in this direction. And so teaching history, there is there are two sides to the idea of two sides of good faith, I will say, because there can be two sides, but sometimes one of the sides may not be operating in good faith. The idea of, do you teach a history that sugarcoats things in order to try to build morale? Like, hey, we're all good guys. We can pull through because, everything we've done before, we've succeeded. We're the good guys. We're not. So you build morale in the country. There's that's a reasonable kind of approach, like it may be short-sighted, it may be misguided, you could disagree, and then there's also the approach of kind of telling it like it is. And, so what do you think, between those two, like trying to tell a history that builds morale with people, or to try to tell the history as it was? Where do you kind of lean towards in terms of kind of the best approach when you're trying to maintain a nation and a system?
Yeah, I think, look, there's probably a combination of both somewhere. Do you need a little bit of both? You need the facts and the reality of history, so that, the whole terminology of, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. So that's clear. And then the second thing is, you do need some sort of propaganda. I hate to use the word, but, to make a nation feel good about itself. We all need to have some sort of shared, cohesive thing that we're all feel good about. Now, for guys like me and you, that might be the system of America, right? Like, I feel great about the liberal democracy that we're talking about, and this idea of being able to solve problems through debate. The way the system was created, with an upper and lower chamber of Congress, and the Senate and the Congress ratifying laws, so on and so forth. And so, in that sense, that's what I would find as ideals to have a shared values of. And I think that's what the tension we're seeing now is. other Americans, some Americans coalesce around the idea that this might be a Christian nation, for example, before they look at what we're talking about here, the secular liberal ideals and laws that are put in place. Other people, have other things that they believe. So I think
sometimes people might, I think you're onto something with that. Like what makes you feel good about the country?
But part of it is like, if you look at the other times this has happened in our history, like the 1930s, or maybe even the 50s under McCarthyism, or then maybe the 60s with the civil rights movement. It's usually when the country is faced with this kind of internal question of who are we, right? Like and the majority group feeling threatened to a certain extent about their own station in American culture and American life. So in the 20s, that led up to the 1924 immigration laws that were very strict back then. It was a certain group of Americans whose descendants maybe immigrated here in the 16 and 17, early 1800s, that came from Western Europe, like England and Scandinavia. They looked hostile, very. They had a lot of hostility. Let me put it that way, towards other European immigrants, like Italians and Spanish and others. Today, we don't see that type of hostility towards European immigrants. Today, it's just hostility towards immigrants from South America. That hostility wasn't around, let's say, in the 50s. People weren't worried about Mexicans and people coming from Venezuela back then. So it seems like the targets of the illiberal forces and those who wish to seek power based on this tribalism, those targets change over time whenever kind of the majority of Americans start wondering, okay, what's going on here? We don't like some of these changes, all that. And I think, to the beauty of the system of the founders, America has seemed to survive all the attacks, including the big one, which was in the 1860s, which has led to the Civil War. And I guess maybe the question we're asking here is, are we going to survive the current attacks?
Well, it's been ongoing attacks. And see, that's the thing. That's why you have to look at it as a progression. And you can't look at it as what was founded was the kind of the end, like that was the beginning of the journey. Yeah, because that was the beginning. And then there is no finish line. You're just going to continue. Like it's about trying to become, a more perfect union, and that doesn't mean that it was better. I mean, that's, a lot of times people do like to look back and say, oh, it was better. Like, we're trying to become a more perfect union, meaning we got to continue to move forward and not backwards, at least from my personal view of it. I think with the history piece, it's difficult because there's different audiences. Like you said, like you pointed out, some people can feel good about the intellectual part of it. Like, hey, we're the first country in the world and the longest running country in the world to run itself by these sets of ideals. And like that's something that makes us clearly exceptional, and other people would say, well, no, I feel special because we have a nation with a lot of Christians, or somebody might say, I feel special because of white people, and so for those people, how do they won't necessarily walk around feeling pride about their country necessarily if it's all about, hey, freedom of speech and, all of that kind of stuff, freedom of religion, they're looking at freedom of religion like, nah, that doesn't make me feel good, so it's difficult from that standpoint. There is a need amongst society to propaganda, but this is where you get into the idea of nationalism versus patriotism. And so with patriotism, when you're feeling good about what the nation stands for versus nationalism is kind of that blood and soil thing. Like we're trying to protect what's actually here right now and not the higher kind of what is my nation about. So I don't think there is I think there's a way that you have to, for leadership, they have to learn to speak to everyone. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're out here promoting white supremacy, but maybe you talk to people in ways that will connect with them. Everybody's not going to feel connected with their country in the same way that you might, or I might. But there are other ways other than you don't necessarily have to promote division in order to reach everyone and to reach some of those people. And I think the biggest problem we have will be when people aren't creative, when leadership isn't creative in terms of how to reach different types of Americans, and they want to have one message for everyone, and they don't recognize that. So you need other messages for people beyond just what might work. What might work for a message for some group of people may not work with others. So you have to find creative ways to do it, because on the other side, there are going to be actors who try to reach those same people with very divisive and destructive messages. And so you have to give them some kind of competing narrative beyond the divisive and destructive one that may have, some appeal to them or may have an appeal to them. And so you have to give them something else. Otherwise, you just cede that person, that group, that mindset to the forces that who've always been here, that have always been pushing for illiberal types of approaches. So I want to get out of this topic, but you said you had one more thing.
No, yeah. So you say some good things there, because I think it's very important for people who are fans of the liberal side of the American story and history in terms of the way the system works and operates.
And when you say you're not talking about current political red and blue.
Correct.
You're talking about freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Yeah, exactly.
I'm talking about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson stuff.
Yeah.
No, but it's just about reminding everyone about this, because I do think that one of the advantages of the illiberal crowd is that they behave in ways that, if they can force those of us who don't want to behave that way, and then we're all kind of in the mud together. So, for example, we've talked about it before, that you and I have grown up in a country that has organizations that are allowed to speak freely, like the Ku Klux Klan. I accept that they have a right to speak that way. But if I ever wanted to shut them down, then I am also violating the idea of freedom of speech. So I have to figure out how to counter their message, for example, without treating them the way they would treat me. And that does take creativity. It takes other things, right? So I think,
and your point being that as long as what they're doing is speech, like obviously once they start crossing into violence and stuff like that, then it's
that was going to be kind of where I was going. So thank you. And that's why one of the hallmarks of illiberalism, at least since the industrial age, the last kind of 200 years, seems to be the use of violence to solve political means. And I think
political intimidation, by the way, violence.
Yeah. And I think we don't have time on this show to go through all of it, right? But I think people should really take a look at the 1930s historically, and especially in Europe. I mean, this is Mussolini's black shirts, the brown shirts in Germany under the Nazis and the Gestapo. These were all, and then in the United States, I mean, this is what I didn't used to see these connections. And now I do, that I'm older and I've better read. The Ku Klux Klan. Hitler got some of his ideas from America, and the brown shirts and the Gestapo were akin to the Klan, to kind of be an extrajudicial force to keep the subordinate group in their place through violence. And so when you think about that, and you think about today, whether it was we had the former Speaker of the House's husband attacked by an assailant with a hammer, but then that person was praised by an entire political establishment and their leaders. And it wasn't seen as it would have been maybe when you and I were little kids in the 1980s. If the Speaker of the House under Ronald Reagan, who was of a different party, his wife got bashed in the head by somebody with a hammer, I think Ronald Reagan would have taken it dead serious. And he would have been like, that's not cool. And this is not, who we are. So I think leadership is important in these days. And what we're seeing is a leadership that is embracing illiberal strategies as a way to try and maintain and ascend to power. And I think that's what really we're faced with today, is one choice, which is maybe not perfect, but it still represents the trajectory of the liberal established order that was founded in the 80s and 90s. And another that is saying, no, we want to just try something totally different, something akin to what we see maybe in Europe or China with the Chinese Communist Party. So I think, it's an interesting thing to live through.
Yeah. I mean, and again, I think it's less that it's not try something new. I mean, because the political violence has been in the United States, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the countless people that were hung.
But what I mean is it's new to us, but people, let's say 50 and under.
Yeah, it's new to us in the sense that it's ascendant at this point right now. I mean, and that's really what we're dealing with. But yeah, I mean, it's as Americans, we still maintain the right to choose, and that's kind of that's part of this. As you pointed out, even if you don't agree with what somebody says, you defend their right to say it, provided it's about words and not about violence or intimidation and so forth. And right now, it's ascendant, the idea of, hey, well, maybe if we don't like what you say or where you're from, what political party you're in, maybe we can, use violence or intimidation against you to try to silence you. And so we'll see, this is why there's no finish line, is that, from time to time, this kind of mindset becomes more ascendant, becomes stronger, because again, we're still not at the point of states just saying we're out. We haven't got to the point of, like a Wilmington massacre. So hopefully we don't have to go there in order to kind of to get more Americans on the same page from the standpoint of the founding principles, and not this kind of tug that's been pulling at it the whole time away from those principles, but that may offer many a more satisfying and emotionally satisfying kind of, hey, tribalism, like let's exert our wrath. So I do think.
Well, I'll say this to finish off: as long as we live in states that ban history books, it'll be harder to rid ourselves of this.
Yeah, well, that's one thing for sure. So, but I think we can wrap from there. Thank you for joining us on part one of our discussion. We'll have some more coming up for you shortly, so please check that out as well.